Imagine a boy of only 7 years old, torn from the comfort of his father's home to be shaped into something greater than himself. Born of noble blood, yet still so small he can barely reach the stirrups of a horse, he is entrusted to the household of a feudal lord. There is no room for pampering or hesitation. His childhood will now be carved by the harsh discipline of training. Mornings begin with prayers and long lessons in proper manners. For before holding a sword, a future knight must learn to speak and carry himself as one worthy of nobility. Catechism, religious devotion, respect for tradition, and obedience to his master, all of these formed the foundation of his life. In the trading yards, the boy learns to ride horses, to run like the wind upon the back of the animal that would one day become his greatest weapon in battle. His small hands begin to wield wooden swords, rehearsing the movements that later would be executed with blades capable of deciding the fate of men on the battlefield. By the time he reaches 12 or 13, the boy is no longer just a timid apprentice. He becomes a squire. It is in this stage that the transformation intensifies. Now, his entire routine revolves around the knight he serves. Tending to armor, polishing each piece until it gleams like freshly forged steel, caring for the horses, preparing weapons, watching with vigilance before and after battles. All of these were the squire's duties. Watch war from afar. He follows it closely, learning to ride under pressure, to carry lances, to always be ready to hand the sword at the decisive moment. But life was not only about war. There were also the torchlit halls, where he learned courtly manners, music, dance, and poetry. A squire was expected not only to fight, but to entertain, to charm, to move gracefully before ladies and nobles alike. This balance between strength and refinement was essential. For knighthood was not merely a military profession, but an order shaped by honor and culture. The moment every well-trained youth had been waiting for finally arrived: the knighting ceremony. Around the age of 19 or 20, the squire, who had spent his youth serving, learning, and preparing, now faced one of the most solemn and symbolically charged rituals of the Middle Ages. Nothing was left to chance. On the eve of the ceremony, the aspirant would fast, abstaining from food and drink, as a way to purify both body and spirit. He would take a bath, not merely to cleanse his skin, but as a symbolic act of rebirth, leaving behind the boy he once was and stepping into the identity of a knight. The night was spent in vigil, alone in the chapel or before the altar, beside his weapons. In that silence, broken only by the flickering of candlelight and the whispers of prayer, he contemplated the weight of the life he had chosen: to serve with honor, to fight without hesitation, and to protect until death. The following morning, the rising sun bore witness to the transformation. The young man attended Mass, and before the assembled community, he received blessings for his sword and golden spurs, symbols of his new status. The pinnacle of the ceremony came when the feudal lord or another knight touched his shoulder, neck, or cheek with the blade of a sword. A simple gesture, yet one heavy with meaning, marking his life forever. Some received a gentle touch, others a firm tap, a reminder of the seriousness of the honor now entrusted to them. Immediately afterward, the oath resonated through the halls, promises of unwavering loyalty to his lord, courage on the battlefield, devotion to the church, and above all, protection of the weak and defenseless. From that moment, the young man no longer belonged solely to his family or his fief. He belonged to the knightly order, a brotherhood guided by faith, blood, and honor, whose weight would accompany him to his final breath in combat. Being a knight was not just about donning armor and wielding a sword. It was about living under the shadow of a code that shaped every gesture, every word, and even every thought. This set of rules, known as the Code of Chivalry, was more than a law. It was a silent vow, an invisible weight carried with each sunrise. A knight was expected to be loyal to his lord, courageous in the face of enemies, honorable in his victories, and merciful to the weak. It was not enough to fight. One had to fight with purpose. Obedience to the church, devotion to God, and protection of the defenseless were as vital as skill with the lance. What defined a true knight was not only combat prowess, but also the ability to uphold values that time itself could not erode. To be cowardly, unjust, or disloyal was more shameful than death itself. Yet a knight's life was not solely made of war. In times of peace, he had to prove his skill in arenas of honor, in tournaments and jousts that drew crowds. There, before the eyes of nobles and commoners alike, he demonstrated his mastery, breaking lances, holding steady on horseback, withstanding strikes that thundered across the field. Punts were also part of his routine, serving both as physical training and as a display of status and dominance over nature. Falconry, meanwhile, was a refined pastime. Trained birds of prey, hunting on command, a symbol of prestige among the nobility, and a living metaphor of the bond between man and beast. And there was yet another, unexpected side. Many knights, between battles and training, devoted themselves to music, poetry, and song. Some became troubadours, reciting verses to ladies in torchlit halls, where armor gave way to the lute, and the warrior became a poet. Thus, the life of a knight was a delicate balance between war and art, between blood and song, between the hardness of steel and the softness of words. A knight's day began early, with the first light of dawn casting a golden glow over the castle towers. The routine started with prayers, a moment of devotion in which the warrior entrusted his strength and honor to God before donning his armor. Then the body was tested through hours of rigorous training, swordsmanship, horseback riding exercises, and weapon drills. Every swing of the sword, every gallop across the training yard, every lance thrown at a target was part of an endless cycle that kept his reflexes sharp and his strength intact. The knight knew that war could come at any moment, so discipline was as essential as faith. Yet, not all his duties were martial. Often, after training, he had to attend to the management of his lands, supervising peasants tilling the fields, ensuring taxes were paid, mediating local disputes, and making sure the Lord's orders were executed without question. As night fell and the day's weight began to lift, the scene transformed. The stone halls echoed with the sounds of banquets, where tables laden with bread, wine, meats, and cheeses gathered not only knights, but also nobles, clergy, and ladies. The feast was more than a meal. It was a social spectacle, an opportunity to strengthen alliances, hear news from afar, and demonstrate proper courtly etiquette. Often, there were readings of religious texts or performances by troubadours, filling the air with poetry and music. As night deepened, the knight retired to his chambers, where the silence of the room contrasted with the noise of the hall. Before closing his eyes, he offered another prayer, a plea for strength for the coming day, which would bring new training, new duties, and perhaps even the call to battle. Thus, amid steel, faith, and responsibility, a knight's daily routine was as rigorous as it when war called. There was no peaceful dawn for the knight. Even before the sun rose on the horizon, he was already awake, preparing both body and spirit for the weight of battle. Squires hurried through the stone corridors, carrying pieces of armor, fastening each link and buckle until the warrior became a walking wall of steel. His sword was sharpened, the shield strapped firmly to his arm, and the helmet closed with a metallic clang that echoed like a creaking iron gate. Before mounting his horse, the knight knelt in prayer, asking for victory and divine protection, knowing that from that moment on, only faith and steel would be his most faithful companions. He received the orders of his commanders and lined up with the others, forming a row of warriors ready to shake the earth with the thunder of hooves. The silence before the battle was almost suffocating, as if the air itself awaited the roar of war. Then came the most feared and most glorious moment, the cavalry charge. When dozens, sometimes hundreds of knights advanced side by side, the sight was terrifying. The ground trembled as if the world itself were breaking apart, and the pounding of hooves blended with the sound of distant thunder. Lance in hand, shield raised, the impact was devastating. Walls of infantry shattered, entire lines of soldiers breaking like wood under an axe. But not all was glory. Amid the smell of blood and smoke, the knight also had to rescue wounded comrades, take prisoners, and participate in ceremonies that celebrated victory or mourned the dead. In those moments, caught between the weight of triumph and loss, he understood that his life was one of extremes. From the merciless violence of the battlefield to the heavy silence of prayers for the fallen. It was in this duality, between steel and devotion, between triumph and death. Over the centuries, the shine of armor began to fade in the face of a new era. What was once invincible on the battlefield was slowly being surpassed by innovation. The longbow, with its power and range, had already shown in the 15th century that even the most heavily armored knight could fall from a distance without ever raising his sword. Soon after, firearms emerged, forever changing the rules of war. The roar of cannons and the discharge of the first arquebuses tore through the silence of the fields and undermined the prestige of a class that had long symbolized military might. Heavy cavalry, once feared, could no longer withstand the relentless march of gunpowder. The wall of steel that once seemed impenetrable, ironically became a prison. Heavy, slow, and vulnerable to projectiles flying with deadly speed. Thus, increasingly organized, and numerous national armies replaced the small bands of mounted warriors that had dominated the Middle Ages. The knight, now stripped of his military prominence, found refuge in tournaments, jousts, and festivals, where armor still gleamed before the eyes of the crowd, but no longer before enemies. Cavalry ceased to be the vanguard of battles and became a spectacle, almost a glorious memory of times gone by. Yet, even as steel lost its place on the battlefield, the myth of the knight never faded. In stories, courtly romances, and legends, the image of the honorable, loyal, and devoted warrior remained alive, fueling centuries of imagination. And that is why, even after the disappearance of his military role, the medieval knight continues to be remembered as an eternal symbol of honor, courage, and idealism, an echo of the Middle Ages that still resonates today.